The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS and Unicom's Next Generation Testing Conference, welcome to today's webinar on Advanced Software Testing, Solving Test Puzzles with Policies, Strategies, and Plans. I am Rex Black, President of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, we have delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. We have a team of international consultants who deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 10 or so books on software testing, including a number of books on the ISTQB program, and I'm former president of the ISTQB and the ASTQB. We are presenting this webinar in partnership with Unicom as part of their upcoming Next Generation Testing Conference, which I will be speaking at. To sign up for the conference and or one of my seminars at it, use the discount code RBCSDISC. That's RBCSDISC at nextgentesting.org. The conference will be held in July, towards the end of July, in Bangalore. Before we start the presentation, a couple notes. Feel free to submit questions at any time, but please note that I will only answer the questions at the end. We will have a brief, say, 10-minute Q&A period at the end, right before the end time at 11 a.m. You do not need to ask for presentation copies. The presentation is on the web. Go to rbcs-us.com, go to the Resources tab. From there, navigate to the basic library. If you're having problems with either the audio or visual components of the webinar, I would suggest contacting GoToWebinar support. We can't resolve those from our side. Usually the problems are related to either browser incompatibility with GoToWebinar, though that's pretty rare now. More common is company firewalls or audio settings on your PC. So today's presentation is on test policies, test strategies, and plans. What are they and how do we use them? So just a note, we did and continue to do a series of webinars on the topic of advanced software testing. And this is one of those in that series. We derived the material from this webinar and the other webinars in the series from the Advanced Software Testing books. We have a new version of the Volume 2, which is the test management book, out. So ask for it. It is available in India, I believe, but you might have to ask around. There are still old versions out there, first editions out there, so take care that you get the right one. So test policies, strategies, and plans are about how to solve your testing puzzles and figure out what the puzzle is. So let's look at these tools and how you would use them. So the test policy is a document, though when I say document, I use that term loosely. It could be a web site on your intranet. It could be a wiki page. Doesn't have to be a Word document or PDF document per se, but it is some written form of communication that explains why you test. What are your objectives? What are you trying to accomplish? Ideally, this should be targeted at not only the testers who need to know what you're trying to accomplish, of course, but also people outside of testing, that's testing stakeholders and project participants who need to understand why you do what you do. So why is testing valuable? What are you trying to accomplish? How do you measure whether you are effectively and efficiently accomplishing those things? What is the typical test process at a high level, of course, not in great detail, but what's the typical process? And how do you practice ongoing continuous improvement of your process? Those are topics that should all be addressed. This should be a short document, 1 to 2 pages. If they get up into 10 or 15 pages, this is probably too long. So to give you an example, here's a anonymized version of a test policy document that I put together for a client. So we have a brief mission statement. We have a description of the risk-based testing strategy. We have a discussion about the way that all of the different test levels are fitting together, what the objectives are for each test level, who's responsible for it, what the focus is. And then we have a overview of the process that occurs in each level. So what is done level by level. And finally, a brief discussion of how the key process indicators or effectiveness and efficiency metrics are to be established. Note that this was a preliminary version of this policy document. In the final version, the key process indicators would actually be defined and targets given for them. So this is a typical type of test policy document. Notice that it is very short. Now, the strategy, the test strategy, the policy says why we're doing what we're doing, and the strategy says how we're going to carry it out. So how are risks managed? The different levels of testing, what are their entry and exit criteria, and what are they trying to cover? Or if you're in a agile environment, instead of entry and exit criteria, you'd be talking about definitions of done, but the concept is the same. At a high level, what are the activities that you're going to carry out? Now, strategies fall into various categories, or more accurately, I guess you could say, there are patterns which can be discerned in test strategies, written or unwritten. Now, every organization has a test strategy. The only question is whether they've thought about it carefully and whether they've written it down. But you do have a strategy. You may not have a test strategy document, but you do have a strategy. So what is your strategy? Well, you need to reflect on how you typically go about testing. That is your strategy. And if you do that, you can recognize patterns in your strategy and see that those patterns correspond to various types of strategies. Do you tend to analyze things like requirements and risks as a way of deciding what to test? Do you create models, for example, models of performance, reliability, and so forth? Do you follow checklists? Do you follow standards? Do you tend to mostly react to the software as it is actually being presented to you? Do you get direction from people outside of your testing group? Are you focused very much on automation and trying to automate tests in order to reduce your level of regression risk? These are all different kinds of strategies, and you'll probably notice that you have some of these strategies present in the way that you go about testing now. I did a webinar a while back, a few years back, on different testing strategies and their strengths and weaknesses. I would invite you to go out to the RVCS website. You go to the resources tab and go to the digital library, and you can see recorded versions, a recorded version of that webinar. And if you're interested in learning more about types of testing strategies, I would encourage you to check that out. Now, not every strategy is right in every situation. So you want to select the strategies that are most appropriate in your particular scenario, for your particular application, the kind of product that you're testing, the life cycle that you're following, any regulatory requirements, so forth. So do be careful about selection of strategies. And of course, the Strategy needs to be, again, how you're going to implement or carry out your test policy. So you should be careful to ensure complete alignment between your test policy and your test strategy. Now, topics to address in the test strategy. Well, basically anything which is common from one test, from one project to the next. The test strategy document should be project independent. So what you want to do is look at those patterns that are present in your projects from one project to the next, and check to see what things tend to be done pretty much the same way over and over and over again. So how is integration done? Is it done through a continuous integration framework, which would be common in Agile, or is it done using top-down or bottom-up? It would be common in waterfall type of approach. Your tests, how are they documented? What level of detail is to be present in the documentation? How do you ensure proper independence of testing, that the testers are bringing a separate and independent viewpoint to the work that they do? Are there standards that apply? Are those standards mandatory, or are those standards optional? When you get bug fixes, what is the process for confirming that a bug is indeed fixed? When you get new releases, how is regression testing done? What kind of automation are you doing? And it would be best to address this at all the different levels so that you have a integrated, uniform, and aligned perspective on your automation across all the different levels. What we see with a number of clients is developers are off, they've got their automated unit testing, the testers are off, they've got automated system testing. They're not making an effort to coordinate across those two groups, and so you're not seeing a consistent coordinated plan, and you're not getting as much benefit out of the test automation as you otherwise would. Is there a process for reuse of the testing work products that are created? For example, data, test environments, test cases, especially automated tests, but also potentially manual tests, setup instructions and scripts that are used to pre-configure environments or data or the application or what have you. Application configuration files. So those are things to think about. How can we exploit reuse to become more efficient? On the topic of environments, what are your environments? How are they configured? Who has access to them? How does software get released into those environments from a testing point of view? What tools are you using? How do you manage and control the testing on a day-to-day basis? So for example, in Agile, you typically have things like daily stand-up meetings. In test groups that I've run, I've had end-of-day debriefs that I do to make sure that I've got good sense of what's going on and that we're all coordinating with each other. How are you going to report your results? What kind of metrics are you going to use for that? How are they going to be gathered? How do you ensure consistency in the metrics? For example, severity and priority, affected subsystem, root cause, all those things need to be consistently gathered across your defects in order to make sure that the defect metrics are meaningful. So how do you assure that? How are defects managed from discovery through to resolution? Who's responsible for doing what with them? The management of your testware, especially your automated tests. How do you manage those? What kind of configuration management system do you have for your tests? Who's responsible for what? At what point in the testing process? Since testing is very much a collaborative activity that is downstream from all of the other activities that are in the project, it's very important that these handoffs from people in the project into the testing team and from the testing team to people in the project, this needs to be very carefully thought out so that you avoid backlogs and situations where something is queued up waiting to be worked on, but the person who needs to work on it doesn't know that they need to work on it. So, here's an example of a test strategy, an excerpt from a test strategy document that I put together for the same client that we were just looking at with policy. So they were doing risk-based testing, as I said. So what would happen is that they would do a risk assessment, and then looking at the overall risk assessment or risk analysis more accurately, they would say, well, what do we think the initial risk is for this application? And it would range from very high to very low, as you can see here. And this is a collective assessment done by the stakeholders who participate in the risk analysis. And based on the initial risk assessment, then there is an approach selected. Now you see the approach there, and you might be wondering, PL, what's PL? Well, we use the periodic table of elements to classify the approaches. There's platinum, PL, gold, AU, silver, AG, lead, PB, and mercury, HG. And basically what we had was stricter or looser entry criteria and exit criteria for the testing, depending on what we thought the level of risk was in the selected testing approach. And you can see that we have rules for coverage. So if you look at the mission critical parts of the applications under test, the system under test, that would all be subjected to extensive testing. Anything that was dubbed non-mission critical would be broad testing, and regression would be fully automated. So that at the end, you'd have a high level of coverage, a high level of confidence, and a high level of quality being delivered, and the residual risk would be low to very low. Notice that with gold, we're talking about high risk, so broad coverage of mission critical, functionality of the application, cursory coverage of the non-mission critical, and manual testing, regression testing. Again, so we see this as, a relatively lower level of risk, so we do less testing. You see the same with silver, decrease in the level of testing being done, and lead is even less. It's just, we play around with a little. Mercury basically means no testing. We picked mercury because it would just slip right through your fingers, basically. Now, one of the things that the strategy should accommodate is the fact that it's not unusual for there to be a desired strategy and then what can actually be done. And so we showed the residual level of risk that would result if the selected approach was less rigorous than what was recommended. So if we say the initial risk is very high, then the approach should be platinum. And remember, that's extensive testing of mission critical aspects of the application and broad testing of the non-mission critical and fully automated regression testing. Well, what if we only have enough resource and time to do silver, the silver approach to testing? Well, then what will happen is that the residual level of risk will be high to medium instead of low to very low. In other words, that when we go into production, we're not going to have that same level of confidence and same level of quality that we would have had if we'd done platinum. But perhaps that's acceptable. Now, usually if you're talking about something that's very high risk, people are not going to, or hopefully not going to compromise severely on the approach. But as you get into the medium and low risk, people would probably be very much tempted to compromise. And this allows you to, this table allows the test manager to make visible to the project team the kind of residual level of risk that's going to result based on the selected level. Excuse me for just a second. I have an issue here. Okay, so the test policy is the highest level. The test policy says this is what we're trying to accomplish. And then the test strategy says when we're one project to the next, this is how we're going to accomplish it. And then finally we have at the most detailed level the test plan, which talks specifically about how we're going to test on this particular project or this particular release. So in a waterfall type of project, your test plan would be written during ideally during the requirement specification phase of the project. In a Agile project, you would write the test plan during release planning, and then that would be potentially updated as part of sprint or iteration planning. But hopefully your plan would be relatively constant from one iteration to the next. Now, what does the plan do for you? Well, the plan is about thinking through specifically how you're going to carry out testing on a project, whether it's Agile or traditional life cycle. And it also allows you to communicate that plan, how you're going to do the testing to other testers, to peers, and to managers. Now, is it possible that you'll need to have multiple plans? Can be. We see this not unusually with clients that have multiple groups involved, like one of our clients that does enterprise software for telecoms. They have 9 different groups, if I'm remembering right, involved in testing, because there are 9 different major systems within their overall system of systems. So each one of these groups has their test plan, and then they have a integration test plan that covers the testing of the overall system. So that's an example of having multiple plans. Now, the thing to keep in mind if you do have multiple plans is that you have a risk of lack of coordination across the plans. Excuse me, the different groups will carry out testing differently, and you'll have an inconsistent approach, resulting in inconsistent levels of quality. So what you typically want to have if you've got multiple groups and multiple plans is what's referred to as a master test plan, excuse me, which would allow you to establish that coordination across the different groups. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in writing plans is very helpful is instead of just sitting in your office and thinking about what you're going to do and coming out with this document and saying, behold, the plan, I have it all figured out. What you would do is say, okay, well, here's what I think we should do. Here's my first draft. Let's look at it and let's talk about it. Have that conversation with the participants and the other stakeholders in the project to make sure that you get consensus on what's being proposed, and also that if you are totally on the wrong track, then you won't be wasting time and energy coming up with a plan that is not consistent with what you need to be doing. So, what kind of things should you cover in your plan? Well, it's very similar to your strategy document, except that the plan needs to focus on 2 things. One is, for those things that are covered in the strategy document, how specifically are you going to implement the strategy on this project? So the strategy document will talk at a high level. For example, it might describe the risk-based testing strategy and the approach to doing risk-based testing in general terms. Now, in the test plan, you need to talk about who specifically is going to be involved in activities like risk identification and risk analysis. You would want to make sure that that was clear. The other thing that you need to cover in your plan are those things that do vary considerably from one project to another and cannot actually be described in your strategy. So now this can vary quite a bit, of course, from one project to the next, but things like what's in scope and what's out of scope can vary quite a bit in terms of the specific things that will be delivered to you, as well as the quality characteristics. Will you be testing reliability? Will you be testing performance? Will you test usability? This might be constant from one project to the next, or it might vary. Coordinating the relationships among the different levels. Now, we saw that in the case of the first client, the first example I gave with the test policy, for that client, the coordination across the levels was very constant and could be described in the policy, but in some cases it's going to be project by project. Schedule, what is the schedule? So in Agile projects, when do you get the first release for testing? What's your level of involvement in activities like acceptance test-driven development or behavior-driven development? How many people do you have? Are there other budgetary issues that need to be addressed, etc.? How are your testing cycles defined? So in Agile, it's fairly typical for people to get a release once a day. So when you get your release, what do you do against it? What's the regression tests? What are the regression tests that get run? What are the new tests that get run? How are those selected, and so forth? The relationships and deliverables between the different participants in the project, both testing and outside of testing, if that's defined in general at the strategy level, that's great, but here we're talking about actually putting names and titles on those specific people, and also describing the deliverables in detail rather than general type of description. So, who specifically is going to set up your test environment, and what items need to be set up in the test environment. Those are the kind of things that would go in the plan. In Agile projects, you need to have your definition of done for the testing activities in the test plan. In traditional life cycles, this would be entry, continuation, and exit criteria that would be defined. Again, definition of the levels and how they work and who owns them and how they're coordinated, what deliverables flow to and from each of the levels, who is responsible for coordinating across the different levels. Those kinds of things should be defined. If that's not universal, if it's universal, then it goes in the strategy, and all you have to talk about here are the things, again, that are specific to this project. Excuse me, they're taking a little swig of coffee. Project risks. What project risks could occur that would affect testing, and how do you intend to manage those project risks? What mitigations and contingencies do you have in place? And then overall test governance. What's the relationship between testers, say, in each of the sprint teams? How do we ensure coordination across the teams if we've got multiple test teams? If we're following a waterfall type of project, what is the organizational structure like? Who's managing the overall project? What's the relationship between the test manager and the project manager, and so forth? Now, if you have work going on in multiple places on a project, it's a good idea to have something like this diagram, which shows the testing activities and test-related activities that are happening in multiple locations around the world. So in this case, it's you see Taipei on the left, California in the center, and Utah on the right. So we had 3 test-related activities happening in Taipei in 3 different locations. We had 2 different locations that were engaged in test-related activities in California, and 2 different locations engaging in test-related activities in Utah. And what you see is that there's a clear flow of deliverables between those different locations. The idea of this diagram being to make it clear to all of the participants on the project and to people outside of the project what this test-related deliverables and relationships are between these different groups. This allows you to avoid having a situation where something important falls through the cracks, as we would say in the United States, or is inadvertently neglected. Now, it can also be useful to define the relationships between different groups. This is another good thing to put in a plan, or if it's universal in a strategy. This diagram shows how different deliverables flow into and out of the testing team, and the relationships, for example, between the test team and management. So having this kind of diagram can be useful, especially as the size of the overall project team grows. I mean, you know, if you've got 5 people on your team and you're following Scrum, and you've got a tester and 3 developers and one guy who's in charge of the continuous integration framework and test automation and so forth. You know, you all probably know what you do, and you've figured out how to work with each other. You don't need a diagram for that. But as organizations start to scale, like the client that I mentioned that does the enterprise software for the telecom companies, you know, on any of their projects, they can have 500-600 people working on it. So it's pretty important when you get up to that level of complexity and size to have clear definition of, well, who's doing what, who's giving what to whom, and so forth. So these diagrams could be helpful for that. Now, entry criteria. This is more common in traditional lifecycle models than, say, in Agile. In Agile, you rely typically on the definition of done and an understanding of deliveries and dependencies between the different activities, and basically once all the prerequisite activities and work products have met their definition of done, that precedes testing, then the testing would start. So that would be basically the entry criteria for the testing. In a traditional lifecycle model, like a waterfall, you need to have specific entry criteria defined, because basically you're going to be waiting until the system is complete. You're not starting testing right away as you would in Agile. As soon as you've got anything that's ready to test, you start doing the system testing of it. Whereas in a traditional lifecycle model, you would wait until the system. Typically, the system needs to be feature complete. So you know, you need to understand what life cycle are you following, and what would it mean for us to be ready to test. This is regardless of the life cycle. So documentation information, requirements, user stories, the system being delivered to you, is it actually ready to be delivered? Are there any sort of utilities that you need, things, for example, to load data or to migrate data from a previous version? Have adequate amounts of testing been done at lower levels? Do you have confidence that the software is actually ready for system testing? Is your environment set up properly? And are you sure that you're not going to have a lot of false positives related to the environment being set up wrong, which can certainly happen? Now, this next slide here shows an example of the entry criteria for one project that I managed the testing of. We followed a sequential lifecycle model on that project, though I have to say it was really sequential-ish. Actually, I would say it was really more of kind of a modified version of rational unified process. We did get waves of features coming in after the testing had started, so it's probably more of a sort of a pseudo RUP. The entry criteria were defined based on the assumption that we would be following a waterfall, so you see some of that here. So the first three entry criteria basically have to do with just the logistics of, are we ready to start testing, from a bug tracking, test tracking, configuration management, release management, and environment perspective. And that would be true regardless. I mean, if you're doing release planning in a agile world, you'd want to make sure, well, before the first iteration starts, we better make sure that all of these things are in place. The delivery of the software, right? So numbers 4 and 5 have to do with the delivery of the software by the developers. And this is where you see the waterfall nature or waterfall expectation, which, as I said, was not actually met. Level of quality, so how many open bugs in this case is how we measured it. Also through 7 and 8 having to do with a smoke test. Another way we looked at quality in an agile environment, you might look at things like the automated test results coming out of the continuous integration framework. And again, this number 9 is indicating the sort of waterfallish nature of the project, where we had a system test phase entry meeting. In Agile, of course, all this decision making about when are we ready to start testing, system testing, would be decided in a daily stand-up meeting. Now, exit criteria, or definition of done for testing, basically this is, have we adequately tested a particular thing. Now, in Agile, you would have a definition of done for an individual user story, as well as a definition of done for the testing of a overall sprint or iteration. Both of those would ideally be defined. And in traditional life cycle, there is no definition of done for the testing of an individual requirement. It's all done at the release level, because in waterfall, of course, you're looking at one big release, right? So what should the definition of done and the exit criteria look at? Well, how completely was the testing done? Did we test everything that we wanted to test? What is the level of quality that we have right now? If we deliver this thing as it currently exists, does that impose an unacceptable level of risk from a quality point of view or a business point of view? What are our options there? Can we delay the overall release in a waterfall type of project? Do we decide not to release this particular feature in this iteration? And if we do that, does that have an impact on other features? We want to make sure that the exit criteria facilitate a discussion that enables and supports smart decision making in terms of balancing quality risk against other kinds of risks. Now, for the same project, we see the exit criteria here. So things that we addressed in the exit criteria. No new features added in the last 3 weeks of system test. Here's sort of the acknowledgement of the iterative nature, the RUP, or Rapid Application Development, or RAD, if you prefer, type of approach that was being used, because features were actually dropping in. But we're asking that the product be stable for at least the last 3 weeks. Of course, in Agile, you're not going to get this, because if you're doing 2-week iterations, you're going to have features potentially dropping into the last few days of the sprint, though that can be problematic. Number 2 and 3 have to do with particular types of bugs, which classes of bugs, if you will, that if seen would indicate severe fundamental problems with the quality of the system that would require deep thought before we proceeded any further. So that's something to think about. Number 4, have we run all the tests? Number 5, have all the must-fix bugs been resolved? Again, in Agile, this would be stuff that you would be able to track via your task management system. and possibly your bug management system if you're also using that. Ensuring that proper regression and confirmation testing has been done. Notice here we're talking about release at this point. We're not talking about an individual feature. Metrics, however you are going to measure your test results, what they mean. So looking at, is the product stable? Is it reliable? Have all the tests been done? Have all the risks that we identified been covered? Number 8, are we actually done? 8 and 9 basically are having a conversation and saying, yeah, we think the quality is acceptable. Some of our clients try to use defect counts for this, defect metrics, where they say, well, 0 severity 1 bugs and no more than 9 severity 2 bugs and so forth. And my problem with that is that every time I've seen that, the only thing that ends up really happening out of that is people play a lot of games with the severity ratings. And it just distorts the use of severity ratings and makes your severity metrics meaningless. So I would encourage you not to have those kinds of things in place. Rather, I think it's better to just have a honest rating of severity and then have an honest discussion at the end of each iteration or the end of each release. You know, are we actually ready to deliver this? What will our customer's reaction be? Now, another thing that needs to be addressed either in the strategy, if it's universal, or in the plan, if it's unique, is how frequently will you get releases? How will those releases be installed in the new environment or in the environment? And if necessary, how would you back a release out and return to a previously known good release? I've seen situations where these 2 steps, the apply and unapply, were not thought through to fairly harmful results. So, do make sure that you've thought both of those through, and don't assume, oh, well, every build that we get will be perfectly good and we'll be able to test it. No, do think about the unapply process. Given the current state of virtualization tools, it's really totally unnecessary to not have a robust, well-defined unapply process. It should be very easy for you to revert back to a known good configuration. Versioning. What's the version naming? How do you determine what the version is for test tracking and bug reporting purposes? That should all be clear. If you're testing a system of systems, then you want to make sure that the issues of synchronization have been thought through. If there's a central database that's shared across multiple systems, definitely make sure that that's being thought through. And make sure, since this is a multi-step handoff, typically involving at least 2 parties, the developers and the testers. Usually there's a 3rd party in there who's involved in configuration and release management. Make sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. We see a lot of problems with clients in this area, so improper planning is almost always a major contributor when those problems exist. So if you're having anything less than a perfectly smooth process for delivery of software for testing, this is probably part of the problem. And definitely test-related project risks. Address the issue of test-related project risks. Things like late releases, inadequate environments, insufficient support by the developers for bugs, and so forth. When you identify your test-related project risks, the best approach often is to mitigate, to take preventive actions to avoid the risk becoming an outcome to begin with. You can also have a contingency plan where you say, if this risk does become an outcome, here's what we're going to do. When you create contingency plans, make sure you have both a trigger and an owner. The trigger would specify how you would recognize when the contingency plan needs to be enabled or launched, and the owner, of course, is the person responsible for doing it. In some rare cases, you can transfer the consequences of the risk onto some other party. That generally does not work, so I would encourage you to avoid that. And for many risks where the impact and or likelihood are very low, ignoring the risk or simply accepting it can be the best option. Now, when you are doing your risk management planning, keep in mind that it is possible to have mitigations or contingencies that make things worse, not better. In some cases, the smart thing to do is simply to let a situation play itself out. Recent history, worldwide history, is replete with examples where leaving something alone, as unpleasant and undesirable as that something was that was going on, would have been far preferable to getting involved and making a further hash of it. Okay, now life cycles. I've been talking about life cycles throughout. Certainly, the policies, the strategies, all have to be life cycle aware and life cycle sensitive. Having a policy and a strategy that are waterfall focused is not going to work if you're following an agile life cycle. And having a strategy that is predicated on a scaling of agile via Scrum of Scrum techniques is not going to work if agile is actually being scaled through Leffingwell's SAFe approach. So you have to be very sensitive to the life cycle and how it actually is carried out. And remember that life cycles are unique. Just because you're doing Scrum, don't assume that what you're doing is like everybody else who's doing Scrum, because it almost certainly is not. In all my work with clients doing Agile, using Agile methods, everybody is doing something a little different. And of course, that was exactly the case with Waterfall too. When I've worked with clients that say, well, we're following Waterfall, everybody does things different. Now, from a timing point of view, in sequential or waterfall life cycles, test plan, project plan written at the same time. Again, the policy and the strategy would precede a project, so those should not be contingent on any particular project. Exit criteria, entry criteria, and so forth are going to be big in sequential life cycles. So in the traditional iterative approaches like Rational Unified Process or RUP, or Rapid Application Development, then your project inception is where the plan is going to be written. Again, the policy and strategy will have preceded the project, and it'll be updated potentially at the beginning of each iteration. And same with Agile, during the iteration or during the release planning, the plan is written. It might be updated or appended to at the start of each iteration, but keep a close eye on that, because if there's too much change happening to the test plan from one iteration to the next, what's probably happening is that you're writing the test plan to be content specific, which you don't want to do. You don't want to write the test plan in such a way as to try to predict which user stories are going to get done in which iteration and which user stories are going to be done as part of the release, because that, of course, is subject to constant change in Agile. You don't want to talk about the specific content. You want to talk in general about how you're going to test the content regardless of what it is. Okay, so hopefully this has given you some thoughts on how you can use policy, strategies, and plans as a guide for your testing. Do make sure that you work collaboratively with the other project participants and stakeholders. Planning is not for you as the tester alone. Planning is for you and for everybody. Make sure that you've got proper alignment across the policy, strategy, and plan. So the policy says why we're going to test, strategy says how we're going to do it from one project to the next, and the plan is how we're going to carry out the strategy on this project. You also want to make sure that you have alignment with other documents and other activities. And finally, please keep in mind relevance, conciseness, and focus. I see way too many documents out there when I do assessments for clients where it's just not relevant. They're just filling in a template and nobody cares. So everything that you write down, you should be writing down for a reason. Keep it tight, keep it concise, and focus on the things that actually matter. Don't get a template and fill in blanks in the template just because a blank's there. If you can't understand what you're documenting something for and who's going to use that documentation, it's a safe bet that you don't need to document it. Okay, well, as usual, I will put the advertisement up while we go into the Q&A session here. We have 10 minutes for Q&A, and I will take questions in the order in which they were received. I'm afraid that we do have a hard cutoff at 10 minutes. Let's see, I had somebody say that they weren't able to hear the sound, but I'm assuming that they resolved that. It must have been a technical problem at their end. if nobody had been able to hear the sound, there wouldn't still be 160 of you tuned in at the end of the period. Here we see Bye Bob, who's a regular listener to our webinar series. Good to see you again. He says, thanks for your time, Rex. What is the best way to use crowd or colleagues for testing? Now, crowdsourcing and so forth, I mean, this is basically a variation of beta testing. And the challenge here often is, what is the level of commitment and what is the level of control that you have over these testing resources, whether we're talking beta or crowdsourced or what have you. Excuse me. That's going to be sort of the key consideration, because if you have some amount of control over them, then you can have a plan and utilize them as a resource in that. If you don't have a lot of control over them, then really you have to think about, well, what contribution can they make? What do I want them to do versus what I want to do with a more traditional set of test professionals? So dividing up the work, figuring out what's in scope and what's out of scope for the crowd versus the traditional testers is key. Here we have another person saying not getting audio, but again, that problem must have been resolved. Sometimes what happens is if your internet connection drops, you'll lose the audio, and then when it reestablishes, it'll come back, and it seems like the dropout was at the speaker's end, but in fact, if the dropout were at my end, nobody would be able to hear me. And since it was only a few people complaining about it, it was almost certainly the connection problems were the remote side. Sieta asks, which comes first, strategy, policy, or planning? Okay, so in the ideal case, Sieta, what would happen is that the policy would be defined first, and the strategy would then be defined, and then the plan. Now, and that's, if you look at things like TMMI, for example, that's what they say should happen. The reality, though, is that most testing organizations, they start off and they just, trying to do something useful and valuable, and they don't even have plans to begin with. And then they start realizing, well, we really need to get more structured about this, so we need to start planning. And then eventually they say, oh, look, there are patterns in what we do from one project to another. We can abstract a strategy out of that, because it doesn't change. The first thing that you start to see, of course, is just each test plan is a copy, paste, and modify of the previous test plan. And then people finally realize, wait, this isn't really smart. And then only at that point do people actually start sitting back and going, why do we do things this way? What are we actually trying to accomplish? This is why I actually prefer TPI Next. If you're going to use a prescriptive model for assessing your testing, TPI Next is much more closely along the lines of what actually happens as organizations mature. Of course, I would encourage you to use a non-prescriptive model like Critical Testing Processes, which was based on the book of the same name, which I wrote. Sieta asks, again, a clarifying question. What is the difference in meaning of the terms policy, planning, and strategy? Okay, so the policy document says this is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is how we're going to measure whether we are accomplishing it effectively and efficiently. The strategy says this is how we're going to implement the policy. This is how we're going to accomplish the objectives defined in the policy. And then the plan is, so for this particular project, this is how we're going to carry out the strategy. The strategy is project independent. Manohar says, two related questions here. How do we fit testing in the sprint for big enterprise products, and what are the different types of quality metrics we should track for Agile? Okay, so what you're going to need to have in big enterprise projects is the usual type of Scrum level testing happening within each sprint. But you're also going to have a very good approach to building your automated tests, and ideally including those as part of the overall continuous integration framework, because you're going to have significant regression risk. The other thing that you're going to need to do in enterprise that's beyond what would be, single Scrum team is you're going to have a test manager or test leader or test coach, they go by different names, but somebody who's coordinating the testers across all the different teams and provides an escalation path if things are going very badly within one of the teams from a quality point of view, so they can become aware of that. You'll have to figure out how things are being coordinated. Is it scrum of scrum, or is it safe? And make sure that the testing is properly aligned with that. Often when there's big enterprise products, there's going to be some sort of system integration testing that's happening, and that will happen towards the end of the release. It may start earlier when the first iterations are together, but it's going to need to continue beyond the end of the last iteration often. So that has to be all thought out, and you have to carefully coordinate the testing that's done at the individual sprint level with the testing that's being done at the overall system level, and then with the testing that's being done at the system of systems level. In terms of the metrics, they're really the same kinds of things that you want to look at in any kind of project. You want to look at coverage and, have you tested the important things? Unfortunately, a lot of times it's just requirement coverage that people are looking at. Have we tested this user story? But you want to look at other things like risks and supported configurations and user personas and so forth. So coverage, test completion, and bugs. The big three from a test and product quality metrics point of view. Let's see. Bob says, is a question from slide 10. Even projects with a different approach, why can't we have one plan using mind mapping tools like Xmind? Because ultimately we're going to deliver one product. Shall we not use more mind mapping tools in planning so that everything is in place, however, still segregated? I've never found mind mapping to be particularly helpful for me. It always just seemed like a two-dimensional form of outlining, which I also didn't find very helpful. When I was in college, people would say, "Oh, you should take your notes as outlines." I'm more of a stream of consciousness guy. So, but if it works for you, then by all means, use mind mapping, provided that everybody knows how to read it. So if you created a test plan with mind map and you gave it to me, I'd be like, sorry, this doesn't click with me. Okay, so Amalan says, team, can we get this recording available after this session? Please guide. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted probably within the next week. Anne says, how would you recommend addressing exploratory testing and test policy strategy planning? Well, I wouldn't worry about it so much at the policy level. In the strategy level, I would talk about setting aside some percentage of the test execution time for each, if you're in sprints, as part of testing each user story. If you're doing a traditional waterfall type of life cycle, then I would, it would be defined as like part of each weekly cycle. My general rule of thumb is set aside about 20% of your test execution time for exploratory types of testing, reactive testing in general. That number will go up, though, because if you can go up. If you do extensive automated testing, then the automated testing starts to take the place of traditional scripted testing or predefined testing. And so if you are using heavy automation, then you might have a higher percentage of your time spent doing various forms of reactive testing, and that should be addressed in your strategy. If there is going to be some variation in terms of how you're going about your exploratory testing in a particular project, then that would be to be addressed in the plan. Let's see. I've got time for one last question here, so I'm going to take Vikrant's question. Sometimes large-scale projects start off with the Agile philosophy, but gradually mutate to a sequential waterfall model towards the end. Would you recommend any additional checks in the test strategy or plan if one sees the risk of this happening? Well, it depends on whether it's whether this waterfallish period at the end is on purpose or by accident. So we have a number of clients that do enterprise software, as I mentioned, following Agile methodologies, and the software development is done using Agile. But once they get into the overall system and testing of the system of systems and so forth, there is inevitably a, sorry for the reminder noise there, there is inevitably a waterfallish type of period at the end where they're stabilizing and they're testing everything together and so forth. So if this is all happening on purpose, then you just say, well, that this is the nature of the beast, and we need to plan for it, right? If what you're talking about is a breakdown in the test in the life cycle, an unpredictable breakdown, then at that point what you're talking about is a test-related project risk, and you need to have your either strategy if this happens frequently, or plan if it's something you think is project specific. In your risk management, you need to have something defined, a contingency defined that says, if the process starts to break down and mutate into a waterfall away from the chosen agile approach, then this is what we're going to do. So you just need to be ready to handle that. So apologies for the time constraint, but we are out of time. It is gratifying to have such great questions, and I see that a lot of you still have questions. So what I would invite you to do is to, for those of you in India, to join me at the Next Generation Testing Conference, and happy to take this discussion up with you. For those of you who are in Europe, if you would like to discuss this further, I will be in Milan on Monday at the testing conference that's going on there. I'm happy to take questions there. And for those of you in the United States, your next opportunity to see me at a conference will be at the ASTQB conference, which will be held in Washington, D.C. in September. So happy to take additional questions there. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. If you think that someone could benefit from this webinar, certainly it is being recorded and will be available here in the next week. So the link will come out, and you can pass that link on. Again, thanks for joining us today, and I hope you picked up some ideas that help you understand your policies, strategies, and plans better in the future. Goodbye.